Alright guys, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and wrap up the chapter this time. We got gymnosperms and angiosperms, and then you're going to know everything you need to know about plants to get through your everyday life and maybe even an AP test. So let's see what we can figure out. Gymnosperms means the naked seed, and they are vascular seed plants, which means of course they have vascular tissue like xylem and phloem, which you need if you're going to grow to be incredibly tall, and they produce seeds on the surface of their ovules, and some seeds are enclosed in like a little papery covering, but really no fruit. So that's why they get the name naked seed. There are several types of these. There's conifers, which we're most familiar with. There's cycads, which are some weird little trees. There's ginkgos, which is only one tree. And then there's neophytes, which are like the craziest things ever, like welwitschia and some weird little plants that just don't fit anywhere else, honestly. So gymnosperms, we're going to start with conifers because that's what people know. It's 600 species of, cone-bearing tree, pine, spruce, that kind of stuff. Trees and shrubs with woody cones. And they're generally going to have needle-like leaves, like in the pine tree, or scale-like leaves, like with, what do you call that? Common juniper, that's the one. And the common juniper makes that little blue thing. It's not actually a berry, it's a modified cone. Who would have known? So those are their leaves. They're going to have a super thick cuticle because, as you guys know, living here in the hills, uh, pine trees can live in some pretty dry environments where water is not available for a lot of the year, and so having that thick cuticle around the pine needle helps that tree not lose very much water. And so conifer plants are very resistant to drought, and they're very resistant to cold. So they can live in some pretty tough places, and flowering plants really can't, or they have to live in a very short life cycle to make it in places like that. And we call these evergreen trees, because while needles are constantly dying and falling off, they don't all do it at once, like a deciduous tree might when all the leaves turn orange and red and drop. These guys will drop a couple needles pretty much year round, but the majority of their needles are going to be green, and so we call them evergreens. Some of the longest lived plants are conifers, including the gnarly little bristlecone pines, some of which are somewhere around the order of 4,000 years old. Those numbers can be a little tricky with these guys because you get multiple plants kind of growing all gnarled together. Some parts of the plant can be dead, and they live in a tough place, pretty windy place. But yeah, bristlecone pines, they're old, they grow slow, and they're just tough as tough gets. So boy, look at that. All right, here's our life cycle. Where do you guys want to start? We've been starting with spores, but that gets a little tiny bit trickier with these guys. So let's start with, well, I kind of want to start you with fertilization, but they're going to go, we can do that. Let's start with fertilization. So, yeah, because the thing that makes this a little trickier than your last diagrams is we've got the male, the female, in the middle. Okay, so let's start at fertilization. So fertilization occurs when we make a zygote. The zygote is a 2N diploid cell buried within this nutritive tissue from the mama pine cone. Thank you, mama pine cone. So there's a little embryo, and I can show you a video of an embryo growing in a pine nut, and it's rather traumatic. And then there's a seed coat around that. Come on, mouse. Thank you. There's a seed coat around that. There's some stored food for that embryo to survive, and that's the seed. And so this seed is dropped from the tree, and it is not eaten by a squirrel nor by a turkey, and it happens to survive, and it gets rained on in the spring, and it germinates into a baby pine tree. And then over the next like 70 years, it grows into this really tall, awesome pine tree. Now, towards the top of this pine tree are these little wimpy pine cones, little tiny babies, and those are male pine cones. And towards the bottom of this pine tree are these really big, tough pine cones that you can like throw at your friends and brothers and sisters. And so we've got two different types of pine cones, male and female. So the male pine cone is going to have pollen sacs on the male cone, and it's going to hold, you guessed it, pollen. And so through meiosis, we're going to make microspores, which is a little packet of cells that are haploid. And those haploid cells are going to divide to make a mature pollen grain, which has a couple of sperm cells, and it has a couple of wings that are going to make it fly a lot further and coat your car and get into your nostrils and make you sneeze and frustrated. So that's that guy. He's ready to fly. Now, lower on the tree, we have these big old pine cones, and those are the mama pine cones, or the ovulate cone. Pollen cone makes pollen, ovulate cone makes ovules, which is basically like tree egg, if you're cool with that term. And so in the many, many, many scales of these cones, you have an ovule, and there's the ovule inside that cone. And so through meiosis, we make a megaspore. Now this is haploid, because that's what meiosis gives you, is haploid cells. And inside this ovule are two eggs with little tiny pores that come out and are going to catch that pollen. And so that is in one of these sections of pine cone. And so you can imagine how many ovules there are in the whole pine cone. And so the pollen takes flight, and through the wind and dumb luck and maybe fate, he lands right there on this little pollen drop of the female cone, and that makes him a winner. And so this weird little thing called the pollen tube grows down all the way down to the ovule and the egg inside of the ovule. And then the sperm goes down, fertilizes the egg, and in double fertilization, another sperm goes down and fertilizes another egg, and then one egg becomes the zygote, and the other one, this is kind of gross, becomes the food storage for the zygote. And then seed and tree, and we do the whole thing over again in 50 to 70 years. And that's the life cycle of a pine tree. Isn't that amazing? Just wonderful, isn't it? I know. I'm amazed too. Okay, so cycads, weird little things that we sell in greenhouses because they're just a goofy looking plant, native to some dry tropics and subtropics. They look kind of like a fern, kind of like a pine tree, but they're just small. Not to say all of them are small. The ones that we sell are small, but they can, and in the past, have been rather large. Then there's ginkgos, with only one species alive today. It's called Ginkgo biloba. It's native to China, and it's deciduous. It drops all of its trees in, in the fall, which is kind of cool. And it also produces a fruit that really stinks, and some of them turn yellow, and people think it's good for all sorts of stuff, but I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And then we have neophytes, which are just these guys who, they have a cone, so we're like, yeah, you're the naked seed, but they are just weird looking plants. They don't fit anywhere. So some tropical trees that produce cones, some desert shrubs, and some leathery vines. So here is your cycad. It has this very Jurassic Park kind of look, just super cool. The leaves are like a fern, but it produces like kind of a cone, but it's not a fruit. And we're like, yeah, what the heck are you, gymnosperm? Why not? And that's in a Cambodian forest. And there's its seeds. These are the large fan-shaped leaves of the ginkgo tree. This is the female tree because it produces these fruits, which are really stinky. And so most of the ginkgo trees that we plant for landscaping are male trees because unlike most, can I say most? Unlike a lot, let's say unlike a lot. Unlike a lot of trees, the ginkgo tree is dioecious. Dioecious means it has two homes. So we have one tree that is just female and one tree that is just male. In the example I gave you earlier of the pine tree diagram that we just spent like 3 minutes on, that is called monoecious, one home. So on one tree, you have male and female, both on one tree. So that's there's a little bonus material for you. And then here we have ephedra, which grows in the American Southwest. I could be wrong, but I think a common name for it is Mormon tea. I don't know, don't quote me. I think it's Mormon tea, and it's basically this green little bush that grows in the desert, and it's got like almost no leaves, and it's actually a gymnosperm, and it contains the drug ephedra, and so people would like make a tea out of it. It would help their headaches as they're living in Utah, which gives you headaches, I guess. There you go. And then the world's weirdest plant. Honestly, this thing's ridiculous. It's a neophyte. It is called Welwitschia, and it grows out these two massive, massive leathery leaves that get all tore up at the ends by the winds, and it grows in like the driest, nastiest environment in the world. And basically, these leaves catch fog that rolls in from the ocean over the desert, and they get all that fog on the leaf, and it rolls down to the base of the plant. And then here's its cones. So a super, super weird plant. And I have a video on Welwitschia if you want to see that in class. It's kind of just, I don't know, a younger David Attenborough checking out a giant Welwitschia plant. So there you have it. Angiosperms, switching gears, okay? Flowering plants. So anything that produces flowers, we're going to throw in with angiosperms. It's a vascular seed plant, and of course, it's going to make seeds. It's going to have vascular tissue like xylem and phloem, and it's going to make flowers and fruits. A flower is a special reproductive shoot, and it contains sepals, petals, stamens. You can have flowers with just male reproductive organs. That would be the stamen, which is made up of an anther and a filament. Or you can have flowers that contain just female organs, which is sepals, petals, stamens, the pistil, and that is the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Or you can have plants that have both. And so that's kind of cool. The innermost part of the flower is the ovary, and after fertilization, the ovules inside of that ovary become seeds, and the ovary itself becomes fruit. So ovule, seed, ovary, fruit. And I'll show you the angiosperm life cycle. So this is a perfect flower. So sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. Many carpels makes a pistil. Many sepals makes a calyx. Many petals makes a corolla. And now you're all confused because there's a lot of terms with flowers. I don't know why botanists, these guys, they name everything. Okay, so I don't know. I mean, where do you want to start? Do we want to go into double fertilization first? Meiosis? Let's see. You know, Let's do it this way. Let's start here. Kind of like our pine tree, we're going to take the male portion of the cycle and we're going to run it one direction. We're going to take the female portion of the cycle and we're going to run that one direction. So it's going to be a little weird, but hang on there. So you have a flower, a perfect flower. The petals are brightly colored, they might smell good, and they attract a pollinator. All of these thin little wires are called filaments. On top of them, anthers. Anthers make a ton of pollen. And so in the anther is the pollen sacs, which of course make pollen. And so through meiosis, we make microspores. Microspores are haploid and develop into pollen grains. So bumblebee lands on flower. Pollen grains stick to bumblebee's belly. Sound like a deal? Bumblebee flies to another flower, and as he's digging around in that flower for pollen, or nectar, or both, the pollen from his belly is attached to the very sticky stigma of the female reproductive organs of the flower. And that's the stigma right there. So that is that. Cool? And if the pollen makes it there, his journey is nearly done. So let's stop there. That's the guy part of the story. Let's switch to the girl part of the story. The ovule and the ovary from really probably a different flower, because that's the benefit of sexual reproduction is, you want to get that diversity. So let's pretend this is a different flower. And in the bottom of that is the ovary. The ovary has an ovule and it has a diploid cell. And that diploid cell undergoes meiosis, and you guys know that meiosis gives you 4 cells because you're super smart kids. And so look at that, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, male was micro because it's small, girl, mega because these are bigger. And so we have megaspores, haploid, 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 haploid. And 3 of these degenerate, just like in humans, right? 3 polar bodies. Anyways, so here we go. We have the egg now because that megaspore has differentiated into the egg. We've got 2 nuclei in this egg, and we've got some other little polar bodies that are in this egg as well. And so there's 6 other cells and in this ovary. And I'll tell you about those in class if you want. I can show you in the botany text. We're not entirely sure what all of them do, but we have a pretty good idea of it. But that'll make it more complicated than it needs to be. So this is here, which is right there, and it is waiting for this fellow who is right here. And so this pollen grows a really long pollen tube with one of the sperm cells. And he goes all the way to the flower and makes a track for the other sperm cell. Now, if we double fertilize, one of these sperm cells follows the track and makes it to the ovule and the egg, and actually fertilizes the egg to make the new zygote or the new embryo. Now, the other guy who made that tunnel, he's going to fertilize these other little cells, and they're going to make a triploid cell. And so triploid is 3 copies of, your genetic material. And so now we've done double fertilization. We've got a triploid cell, and we have an embryo. And so as it starts to develop into a seed in the bottom of this flower, the 2N embryo is going to grow out. We have a seed coat around it thanks to mom, and that triploid cell that we fertilized is going to become what's called endosperm. Endosperm is food for the developing embryo. And so we fertilized our own food container for that seed. And that's what this whole cycle looks like. And then eventually these flower parts, as fall comes around, will wither away. Everything will fall off, and you'll be left with a fruit hanging on a stem, exposed to birds and deer and other animals. And those other animals will eat that fruit, and then they will deposit the seed a little while later, and it will grow the next generation of flower. And then the whole thing starts again in the spring, and on and on and on she goes. So 90% of all our species alive today are angiosperms. They are incredibly successful, and they're incredibly diverse, and they're probably so successful because they are so diverse. And the angiosperms have several characteristics that give them an advantage over the gymnosperms. For example, a flower doesn't have to grow for 50 years before it can produce a pine cone. It can grow in a month and have a flower in 2 months and have a ton of fertilized ovules in 3 months, and by the time fall gets here, we're good. They also have an advantage because they're pollinated by animals, and so it takes the guesswork. For a pine tree, it throws millions and millions of pollen to the wind, and it is a blind hope that one hits the female cone. With animal pollination, we take a lot of that guesswork out of it because we have a bee, and the bee gets the pollen on his belly, he's looking for more food, and the odds of you getting to another flower are pretty decent. And so that's an advantage. And then they also have enhanced seed dispersal because not a lot of animals want to eat the pine cone. The squirrels will. They'll tear apart those female cones. You see that all the time. They tear apart each little section of a cone. But a lot of animals want to eat fruit. When they eat fruit, they disperse the seeds, and that is very, very advantageous for the flowering plant. So our oldest angiosperm lineages that we're aware of that include our modern representatives is probably a shrub called Ambarella. Water lilies are also very, very old. And then a little flower called a star anise is also really old. Some other groups that have become dominant in the fossil record are magnolids, such as avocados, monocots, like our orchids, and then eudicots, like everything with branched venation, like tomatoes. So angiosperms, are super important economically and ecologically. Anything that produces flowers, of course. So we're talking feeding animals, sheltering people, feeding people. It's super important. You might not think of it because their flowers are very small, but a lot of our cereal grains are angiosperms. So the wheat and corn and rice and barley and oats, and that's going to be like 95% of the food for the human population. We're
basically a big population of canaries. We could survive on grain, and we feed the grain to our livestock, and we feed the grain to ourselves, and that's the most widely planted crop. And legumes are the second most important source of human food, and that's like beans and lentils and that kind of stuff. So they're a hugely important food source. We also make a lot of fabrics out of angiosperms, flowering plants. Linen, cotton, hemp, burlap, all those things come from flowering plants. And of course, there's a lot of oils that we extract from flowering plants that we use in all sorts of different stuff, personal care products, detergents, industrial lubricants, fuels, all that kind of stuff. And so flowering plants are super, super important. So here's some points to ponder. What adaptive advantages might gymnosperms have had over other living plants at the time? And what are several factors that have led to the dominance of angiosperms? And, uh, and that's a chapter. So I hope you have a better understanding of the plant diversity that we have on Earth today. I hope you understand how each type of plant is really well suited to a particular environment, and one's strengths might be another's limitations, but they really are the ones that survive today. Are really well adapted to their environment. They have really complex interactions with other species in their environment, and they are really important to us. So, kind of a fun chapter. Anyways, thanks for your time.